Hello, guys. Welcome to Literary Tea. I'm Anna.
I'm Georgie, and we'll be your hosts in this podcast, in which we'll talk about literature together with other teams.
And today's episode is called Is Classic Literature Really That Important? Georgie, have you ever read any classics?
Yes, quite a lot of them by now.
Oh, okay. How can you classify your experience with classic works? I mean, if you were to decide a good experience and a bad experience, what classics would you put in each category?
Okay, I'd say that I've had many struggles dealing with classics, exactly because of what you said. I had good experiences, but some bad ones. If I were to classify them or to select one good and one bad, I'd say that one good experience that I had was reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which is considered a classic. And
Why? What was something special about this work that marked you or something like that?
okay, I think that the content that the author, put in the work. For example, it is a very gothic novel. And when I first read it, I was really into that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So it made me feel interested about the book, and this interest of Gothic made me want to keep reading it. And the story is not that slow, if we can put it like that, because some classics, considering the time they were written, they have a slow pace in the action.
Yes.
And Wuthering Heights, no, it's full of conflicts all the time. So,
And jumps of the plot, if you may say like that.
yeah, yeah.
It's like something is going in a pace and then suddenly something happened in the story and everything turns upside down like that, right?
Yes, exactly. And it is a very, dramatic work. I think it is a very dramatic work, but not in the sense of plays,
A place.
of playwriting, but in the sense that there are constant outbreaks of passion,
Too much emotion
Yeah, too much
involved.
emotions, and it makes you want to keep reading it.
Yes,
It's involving.
it's very visceral, I guess.
Yes, that's the perfect word to describe it.
Yes.
So that's the reason I think it was a very good experience for me. For you to have some notion of how it was a good experience for me, I read it 3 times. I read Wuthering Heights 3 times because in every time I read it, I could identify something different that I hadn't noticed before in terms of the complexity of the work. The different layers that we can find when when we read, paying close attention to details and to themes, because sometimes you read only to, acknowledge the narrative, the plot.
And those layers, you can only notice them if you visit the work one more time.
Yeah, I think so.
It's sometimes it's necessary to visit one more time to
Yeah.
see other perspectives.
Because sometimes when you read the first time, you may find the language barrier,
Yes.
and you may end up setting aside these layers, these themes. But when you revisit the work, you can read focusing on something
Yes.
if you want to.
What about the bad experience?
Okay.
Do you have any?
I have a very recent one. Actually, it is from this year. I think it was in last February, I tried to read The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo.
Victor Hugo.
But it didn't go well because I think that it didn't go well with me because, the story is very sensitive, to some point. It's very humane.
But did you finish?
No, I
Oh.
didn't finish. I read almost up to the middle of the book. I think I read 40% of the book.
Something happened and you decided to stop.
Yeah, I think what made me stop was the slow pace of the book.
In your perspective.
Yeah, in my perspective. And I'm used to these classics that have a slow pace for me. That things take much more time to happen. But in the case of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, what made what really, you know, uh, got to my nerves was the fact that the author puts so many
Details.
details in terms of his history.
Mm-hmm.
I like history, but in this narrative,
Like the context of the
yeah,
time?
it like delays the action. For
Okay.
example, he puts so many descriptions of how Paris was built. There is a whole chapter talking about this,
Mm-hmm.
describing the houses, the churches, the streets, the stones, the
Y-
everything around
It's
it.
like you wait too much for an action, for something to happen,
Yeah,
and that never, quote, never
yeah.
happens.
So I think I will try to read it again,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that now is not the moment.
Not the moment.
Yeah. And what about you? What were your experiences like? Did you have many bad or good experiences? How would you put them? How would you select one book to be a bad or a good experience?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if the books that I've read in my life, they are all considered classics or not. Because most of the books that I'm used to read, they are from the 20th century. So normally we consider them more contemporary or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And I'm not sure if they are classics or if they are like a subdivision, a subcategory of classics like contemporary classics. I don't know. But one good experience and one bad experience that I can say here is that Pride and Prejudice was a good experience and Crime and Punishment was a bad experience. In the same sense that, as you said in your experience, I haven't finished Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky because the story is not that the story isn't good. I think it's interesting. I get the social critics that he does there about in which point are you really guilt about what you do? Aren't you just a victim of society and the system?
But considering that, from what I know, Dostoevsky's works, they are quite long, right?
I don't.
Do you have problems with this, with the pace of the
No,
action?
I don't have problems with that. It's just that I think it's a problem that I have is that I take a long time to understand the characters.
Okay.
So sometimes even if they have very different names in a work, I take a long time to understand who is who. And I get confused when I'm reading. That happened when I read A Hundred Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very confused about their names, who is doing this right now. And Crime and Punishment, I think it's also because it was my first work in Russian,
Okay.
in Russian literature that
Mm-hmm.
I read, and the names are very different. So for me, I really I have difficulties with remembering this, but the plot is interesting. I think I just lost interest, but it's not that I
Okay.
consider it bad, a bad story. The good experience, it's on the other hand, it's like I was really afraid of my ability to read in English, and I was always telling myself I will not understand this because it's an old English for me at the time.
Uh-huh.
I considered the 19th century English old English.
But do you remember how old were you when you read
Crime and
Pride and Prejudice?
Pride and Prejudice, I was 20.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was 2016, 2015. I guess I was 20. I hadn't had at the time much experience with English lit, but surprisingly, I understood the story. I had already watched the movie, so I knew the plot.
Okay.
But concerning the language of the story, I hadn't difficulties, so I was surprised with myself. And the book is not that small.
Yeah, it isn't.
We have almost 400
Yeah.
pages. So it was a surprise, really a surprise for me. It's not that I understood everything, but I understood most of it. And I was more like proud of myself and of overcoming the fear that I put in my mind than of the story itself because I knew the story.
Do you think that what makes you, like today, say that it was a good experience? Does it have more to do with the fact that you could read it in English and accomplish this, or the narrative itself, the themes, the way the characters are built? What called more your attention when you were reading?
Yeah, I think my explanation about good experience differs from yours.
Mm-hmm.
But the content, when I was a teenager, the content would interest me more
It's
because
quite
it's
dreamy, yeah.
yeah, it's not so dreamy concerning Jane's works. It's
Mm-hmm.
one of the most like not so illusional, not so romantic, but the story itself, when I was a teenager, interested me more. It's like marriages, romance. Today, I read it more like concerning the historical importance of it
Okay.
than the plot. But the same as you, when I read, for example, Wuthering Heights, even though I read it in Portuguese, I felt like what you said about your experience.
Mm-hmm.
I felt the visceral emotions of the story. I I was captivated by the characters, the plot, but it's I think it was a different experience from Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice for me was more like a literary challenge than a personal experience of liking it so much. Even though I like the story
Uh-huh.
very much, the Elizabeth Bennet, for me it's one of my favorite characters.
I liked that you mentioned Pride and Prejudice because last year in March I gave my sister this book in Portuguese because she was 15 at the time. She doesn't read in English, and I think that she's facing the same problems that I had, for example, with Vitor Hugo, because I gave it to her last year, but she couldn't make up to I think, the seventh chapter, for example. And I was asking her, why didn't you continue reading it? And she said to me that it was because it was so slow. She said, George, it's so slow. Things take a long time to happen. I don't have patience to wait and keep reading until something interesting, really interesting happens. And I gave it to her, imagining that she would want to try something different.
Maybe it's not really the time,
Yeah,
and it doesn't mean that she will hate it forever, right? It can be only by now. Maybe 5 years from now, she may have another vision
yeah,
about
she's
the
quite
story.
young.
Yeah, so, but it's interesting that you mentioned your sister and also our experiences because that reminds me like why we have so different experiences when we read classics, you know? We just said two extreme um, kinds of experience,
Uh
one
huh.
good and one bad, and it's about the same type of literature.
Yeah.
What do you think makes it so different?
Well, one reason that it's something that I've also been thinking recently because of my final paper. It's because, we are different persons, each of us. We're different, yeah? We have different tastes, and it has to do with it. I think that the way we read the world, our also our social background, our educational backgrounds, they may influence the way that we see these classics or these works in general.
The way we experience it.
Yeah. So my life experiences are different from yours, and
And from your sister?
yeah. So I think that's one of the major reasons why we experience the readings differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes.
very personal, you know.
Yes, and I agree with you, and I also think it depends on the moment of your life that you're
Mm-hmm.
reading it. As you said about your sister,
Yeah,
she's like a
I
teenager.
agree.
It's not that this argument is restrictive, but sometimes we are living a different time in our lives, and some kinds of stories may not hit us in a way the author or the original purpose of the work meant to be. For example, a 15-year-old teenager is really that mature or, I don't know, experienced person to understand things about old people, ancient people.
Yeah, I don't think they are. And we can take it as an example, our literary experiences in our country, here in Brazil.
Yes, because I'm thinking about The Old Man and the Sea
Ah, okay.
of Ernest
Uh-huh.
Hemingway. And we have an old man in the plot, and we have some issues that he's passing through that talks about life, talks about what is like being old, what is like having your life um, in your back, your story. And someone that is very young may not understand that in this way because it's a young person, you know.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it also, it just reminded me of my bad experience from Victor Hugo's
Mm-hmm.
The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, the way he puts the hunchback, you know, the way the hunchback suffers, and then the way the girl in the story approaches him, is very subtle, and it requires some sensitiveness, you know, to notice this. I think it's similar to the Old Man in the Sea. So
Yes,
the time that you're in your life may contribute or not for you to understand the work, for you to feel the work as it
yes.
should be.
Unless you have passed through some experiences, as you said, your backgrounds are very individual. So unless you passed through some experience that were very unique, you may understand these plots more close to the way the author suggested when he or she wrote the play or the work, the novel, I don't know. But generally, it's more like, what do you? It's the old sentence we listen. What do you know about life? It's like you're 13, you like reading, but what do you know really about life? What do you know about a heartbreak?
Yeah.
What do you know about being old? What do you know about marriage? Some experiences you just don't know, and you have to have a sensi- you have to be sensible enough to understand these works. And sometimes you just are not, and I don't think that is a problem.
Yeah.
I really am from the team that says it's okay not liking this work. It's not because some old people said this work is a classic that you have to read and like it. I don't like that argument.
For example, yeah, let's take Charles Dickens.
Yes.
He was a great novelist of the 19th century in England. Yeah. For example, Queen Victoria loved his writings.
Mm-hmm.
But I may take one of his writings today, read it, and not like it. And that's okay. It's completely far away from my reality, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Unless I'm reading it for some other purpose, academic, or in order to in order to really try a different kind of reading.
Yes.
But yeah, I see your point that it's okay not to like it, even though it is so famous, it is so widespread, and
Yes, I think we should tolerate our own taste, our own choices, because I think another fact that makes classics dislikable, if I may say like
uh huh,
this, is the language. Sometimes the language doesn't help.
Yeah,
And I
yes.
don't blame teenagers who have to read classics at school. I don't blame them. It's not easy. It's not ready for you. I mean, the work is um, made it easy for you understand. It reflects a time, it reflects a century, it reflects a society from another time that it may not concern you anything about this.
Yeah. I think that what's important is that you at least try.
Yeah, give it a
Yeah,
try.
give it a try, but you don't have to feel like obliged to, say, I loved it because it was a classic and, it is great just
Mm-hmm.
because someone who's very famous wrote it. No, but at least you should try and
Mm-hmm.
see if you can go with it.
Yes. So, George, we've been talking about our personal experience with classic literature, but after all, what is a classic? What determines a classic work?
Well, we could, present our own thoughts on this, but that would take too much time because it's difficult to define what is a classic because the moment we define what a what works
Classic.
are classic, we are putting others aside. So let's not take this responsibility on us.
Yeah, it's like the question what is literature and what is not
Yeah.
literature, right?
There is a book from Italo Calvino, that he tries to discuss what is a classic and why is it important to read
Mm-hmm.
classics. And for him, he presents lots of different characteristics and some definitions for a classic work. But we could say that for Italo Calvino, a classic uh, is a book that when it is revisited, we find something new or something different that hasn't been found yet.
Like what you said about Wuthering Heights, right?
Yes, yes, yeah.
So a classic would be a work that you can revisit.
Yes, because for him, a classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say.
Mm.
So, depending on who is going to read it, age after age,
It still has something to
it
say.
still has something to say.
Oh, I know another definition. It's not an author's definition, but he brings what was considered classic literature in the ancient times, like until the
Mm-hmm.
18th century. That is Charles Augustin Sainte-Beuve. I think it's an essay that he writes, and he says that the ancient definition of classic would be a work that explore and defines a style. It causes admiration in who reads it and also represents an authority in what is written. So for me, it's more like a definition that it's talking about the first works of different nations. It's like, for example, in today it's easy for us to think about classics. They
Mm-hmm.
are already there.
Yeah. Someone
We
said that they're classics and
we
we know
accept.
them by classics.
Yeah, we know them and we accepted the definition someone else said that they are. But if we go back on a time that we didn't have much references in literature, and we had, for example, Dante on one side, we have Cervantes in another side, it's more like why are they classics? Considering this definition is more like they are representing their countries by their works because they are using their language, they are using a style, and they are determining that this is Italian literature, this is Spanish literature. It's like a mark, uh, it's like a pioneerism, if I may say. And this definition, even though it is restrictive, if we may say, it's like not everyone will be in edit, not everyone, but considering this time, yes, this definition fits very well.
There is this guy, Arnold Bennett, that in his essay he presents another definition that is somehow similar to what we've just said, you know, by Saint-Beuve. Arnold Bennett says that classics are works that were revisited somehow, that were uh, they are books that give pleasure to a specific group of people. So this specific group of people, these enthusiasts of this work or of this author, they decide to keep passing it on. So here we've got the idea of what you just said. You know, someone's gonna say that they are classics. But in this case, in the case of Arnold Bennett, it is somehow more arbitrary. I don't know if you agree with me, because okay, even though not everyone has access to some types of lit, uh, at least Arnold Bennett doesn't say that it is a let's say only scholars, for example. Another person may say that no, classics are defined by a group of scholars. Arnold Bennett also points to it, but not necessarily. He says that, you know, if you are an enthusiast about Pride and Prejudice, for example, and you like the work, uh, you make this work be a classic
Oh,
because
okay. So
because you keep revisiting it, even though it's been so much time that it was written.
I understood now what you mean by arbitrary. It's like
Yes.
it can be personal build.
Yeah.
I can build my own concept of, not concept, but my list of classic works.
Yeah, we are keeping them alive. So if I read Pride and Prejudice because I like it, and you also read it because you enjoyed it, then we are keeping it alive in this sense. And we are reinforcing the fact that Pride and Prejudice is an important book.
Or it is that it is necessary,
Yeah.
maybe until today, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because up to today we find some relevance in it.
Yes. Considering, okay, we have some definitions here about classics. And what if we consider it the English language? Because, of course, Charles Augustin Saint-Beuve is French, Italo Calvino is Italian, and Arnold Bennett it's another nationality. But if we consider our own context here, that is English, who do you think would be a good representation of classic?
Well, considering the fact that if we take these definitions that we said, trying to put them as a parameter, we can put like Shakespeare, for example.
Yes,
He remains up to today.
we can say he remains alive.
Yeah, he remains alive.
Until
People are
today.
keeping him alive.
Yes, they are. Exactly.
Even though even by adapting his plays or studying his plays,
Yeah, it's really a way of keeping it alive.
or only by reading the plays, you know, for personal reasons or personal enjoyment.
Yeah, I think if we think about Shakespeare, of course, he is literature, but he is also a specific place of literature, that is playwright.
Yeah.
So considering playwright, I think he's in the same level as Molière is for the theater in French.
And
He's
you know,
very famous.
And you know what really calls my attention when you talk about Shakespeare is that I don't know many people who enjoy reading plays.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if in other countries it's a very common
Yeah.
practice, But in Brazil, considering also language students, even Portuguese students and English students, it's not it's not so common for us to read plays, to study plays,
Yeah.
right?
I'm not going so deep in that, but it just it just occurred to me right now that here in Brazil we probably don't have uh, this habit of reading plays, especially because in our context, plays are are much more for the upper classes.
I see.
You know, for
It
example,
can be. I would go to another argument.
uh
It's
huh,
more like I think we are more novelists,
yeah,
kind of literature. We have more novelists than playwright people who write plays. I think it's more like this.
yes, but you know, going back to your previous question, considering okay, Shakespeare is recognized for his plays mostly as a drama, but in general, when we think about say something like the major English also, I think that would be Shakespeare. Yeah,
Yeah, c- not considering that he writes only plays and not novels. Yes, he is famous. He carries a legacy, right?
because if we take for example Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, uh, it is prose. Okay,
He had an importance
yeah,
in
versed prose. Let's put it like that.
yes, he had an importance historically speaking about English literature, but considering like representation of a country, I think Shakespeare deals with this very well.
Yeah,
He carries the name.
and I think that it also has much to do with the fact that in his time, uh, to watch a play was not expensive.
Yes,
Yeah,
and it's something very important to mention about Shakespeare that he makes it accessible.
yeah, he's very popular in this sense.
Yeah, which is a quite opposite from the definitions that we were mentioning.
Yeah,
In some ways, I think some characteristics of Shakespeare makes it a classic according to the definition that we brought, but in some others it's like a contradiction because he wanted to make his work popular in a sense of accessibility.
I'd say that they were mainly accessible considering the fact that the playhouses they were in they were on the south bank of the River Thames at the time, considering London,
Yes.
and that place, was not a place for the upper classes. Only people uh,
From lower
from lower
classes.
classes, uh, would take part in this place of the city.
Yes, and also he used to his plays. If you wanted to watch a play, you wouldn't pay too much. So it's like literature is accessible for me that I am poor. This is interesting
Yeah,
considering what we know about literature that not everyone could read, not everyone had an education, but in this sense it's interesting the accessibility that he makes with his own work.
and because if we stop to think, his audience were, let's say, drunkards, people that were drinking around,
Yes,
uh,
prostitutes.
prostitutes, uh, dealers. So
Yes,
that was his audience in the playhouses. So he had to make it simple,
yes,
and even though it was simple, he had a very proper style.
which matches the definition that we were talking about.
Yes, yeah,
He has a proper style and also a mark that it's the neologisms of Shakespeare. He used many words that were not registered at that time. And until today, we have them, we still use them, thanks to him. Not because he invented some, in some cases he invented some words, but also because he registered it and we can use it until now.
And it is interesting how these words they remained. Uh,
Yes.
Regardless of the genre of the work he wrote, even if it was a tragedy or a comedy or histories. But since we are mentioning him, I think that would be interesting if we gave like some examples
Yes.
of let's say tragedies, for example, since the tragedies were the most famous. Yeah.
So if we would mention like the most famous, I think Romeo and Juliet would be a good
Yeah.
example.
Perfect.
And the themes that he uses and he mentions on the plot, I think they have a characteristic of being universal. And that's why it's still alive. Not only because people read it, work with it in a play and etc., but because the content of his works, they are universal. It can happen in any time, of course, different context,
Yeah.
because time changes everything. But for example, in Romeo and Juliet, if we deal with some dualisms like love and hate, life and death, young and old, love and tragedy, for example, and these things live not harmoniously, because I would be naive to say that, but it's like life is this. It's dealing with these dualisms. We all have this.
And what I think is great about Romeo and Juliet, okay, we have these universal themes and motives, but as you said, everyone has to deal with these dualisms, and the way that he portrays it, in the sense that the language for Romeo and Juliet, it is very lyrical, yeah. And I think that for me it is great because I think that the way the characters speak in a play, mostly poems. The play is full of poems in very poetical language. It doesn't keep it distant from the audience.
Yes,
We
it's
have a very
unique,
refined style.
refined, unique, and so other characteristics. I think another famous play is Hamlet, right?
Yeah,
I think you can find most of these themes in another play like Hamlet, like, right?
yeah. When we were talking about Romeo and Juliet, you were mentioning the fact that okay, the themes are very universal. Even though there are situated historical social historical characteristics for the time. In Hamlet, this is very we can see it very clearly. For example, in Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, we see a lot of um, inferences to uh, political uh, political
Disputes.
disputes at the time, which were very specific for the Elizabethan time. But apart from this, maybe anyone that reads Hamlet today can at least identify with the universal themes that you mentioned. So we have this political situated context, but the themes, the humane themes, they are very universal. For example, we have revenge. It's a very important motive of the play. It moves the play. It is Hamlet is the tragedy that almost doesn't have action. It's much more indecisiveness and introspection because Hamlet is very indecisive.
It's like the representation of
Yeah.
the indecisiveness and introspection.
Yes, he's very introspective in the sense that he doesn't know how to conduct a revenge, a
And
vengeance.
why is that universal? Because we all of us have at least one moment in our lives that we are very afraid of doing something because we don't know if that choice would be the right one.
Yeah.
So it's like 500 years ago, the play, but we can still relate to these kind of things, right?
Exactly. Another theme that we can find in Hamlet is the, this dualism between living and dead, the living and the dead. Because in the play, Hamlet's father, comes out of purgatory, we infer, and he's already dead, but he asks for his son to revenge him. And even though we don't find today people coming for us to revenge them, but the taboos involving death and the different creeds and beliefs, especially religious ones, when it comes to death,
Yes.
of purgatory or hell and all that stuff, it still pervades our discussions nowadays.
Yes.
So it's not settled. Like we also have the dualisms between self and society in Hamlet. Hamlet doesn't know basically how to deal with society, with political disputes and
His
problems.
duty
His
as a
duty,
prince.
yeah, as a prince. He's always, trying to find ways to escape.
It's like sometimes I think Shakespeare was like talking about an aspect of human being that didn't exist, the concept at the time, because that it's not so different for me than a teenager.
Yeah, and we can simply identify with them.
Yes.
So that's what's so great for me about Shakespeare.
Because Hamlet is also a young man.
Yeah.
He has his duties. He has to make decisions that will change his life, and he is also passing through difficulties, through changes that they don't depend on his decision, but he also has to make decisions. We all had at least one moment. Sometimes they are most in the adolescence phase that we don't know what to do. We have to start thinking about ourselves and what to do and know these choices and its consequences, but we also are afraid of doing it because we are afraid of what can come after we choose it. So it's all of it is relatable.
So yeah, so I think that as long as we have human beings that need to deal with these questions, these human beings will probably identify with Shakespeare's characters, the characters that he created to represent the world, to
Yes.
represent, our inner side. And we've been discussing, classics. Okay, so we already talked about
Some definitions.
some definitions, our experience is good or bad, and we highlighted Shakespeare as an example. Okay, guys, not because he's the only classic, but because if we stop to pay attention, okay, he is the major one. Yes,
Yeah, he's the most mentioned one.
yeah.
So that's why we decided to talk about him a little bit, and also because he had a very peculiar style, as we mentioned before. His lyrisms and his prose
Yeah.
within a play.
We even gave some examples, right? We talked about Romeo and Juliet. I tried to give some themes and examples that we find in the tragedy of Hamlet. But Anna, considering all this that we discussed, do you consider, relevant to read Shakespeare today? Considering that he wrote for an audience in the 15th, beginning of the 16th century.
Well, I think we started discussing a little bit about his importance as an author and his importance considering literature, but it's good to reinforce that. Shakespeare, is that kind of author that, as you said about Wuthering Heights, you can always find something new if you read more than once any work of his. You can always find new things. And what is impressive about him is that he really has much to say in his details. From the plot, that he brings universal things, as we said, from the style that he has, because okay, he uses poetry in some lines of his character, but it's not any poetry. It's a poetry with the perfect metric, with the perfect rhymes, and so on. He has many puns, so it's very rich. His works are very rich in terms of language. And last but not least, it's a good portrait of a time, a portrait of a society in one time. So, as we all use that when we are reading any books, we can see the society, that country, that city in that specific time that is portrayed in the work. So, it's good to see what was like when Queen Elizabeth was reigning, you know?
Yeah, I'd like to stick just a little bit more on this society aspect because, uh, when we read a Shakespearean tragedy or comedy, we're not going to get all the features of Elizabethan's reigning. Yeah, of course, but we may understand better how the context of the political context, the conflicts in politics, in religion at the time, they influenced art, no, because it
Yes,
is art, literary
of
art.
course. He was a revolutionary man.
Yeah,
He wrote, uh, it's like I'm breaking all barriers and I'm doing my style. He is very, he really marked a time. He has his own style, even though at the time we had other playwrights very good, like,
for example, I think one of the most known for the time, apart from Shakespeare, was Christopher Marlowe. He
yes,
wrote Dr. Faustus, for example, and it's
yes,
very well known. But yeah, Shakespeare, uh, let's say that he got the scene.
yes. And for me, apart from the argument that he's a classic because he has a proper style, because we can always revisit his works if we consider the definitions that we were talking,
Yeah,
but he has a characteristic that for me is more like I admire you even more. That is, I want to make my work accessible. Today, we think it's not
yeah,
because some characteristics of the language it's not used today. Some verbs, some way of saying things are not usual from for today in English, more postmodern English, if we may say. But at the moment that you decide that I want to put my style and my complexity in this work, but I also want to make it accessible for people like prostitutes,
dealers,
dealers,
drunkards.
dunkers, to understand and feel what I want them to feel. That for me is the mark of a genius, of a person that knows exactly his potential.
Yeah, it is amazing that he could, he wrote both for that audience that went to the playhouses that I just mentioned and the Queen. No, he had to present his plays, directly to Queen Elizabeth and then to King James.
Yes.
So he wrote for both audiences, and uh, even though the language nowadays for us may seem some sort of barrier, if you at least would like, would make an effort to try reading the play for its content. Let's say let's take out for the moment the language, the way he wrote at the time. If you take a good translation to start with,
Yes,
yeah,
if you don't feel
safe, feel
confident
confident.
enough to read in English, and also the original language from that time, because we have modern versions
Yeah,
with English from today. But if you don't feel confident to read either from the English that we use today or the English from the original work, you can read in a good translation and also feel it.
Exactly, because for me, apart from the language, the style, which is also very important, and you may revisit it later if you're not feeling confident right now to read, the source text. Uh, for me, what makes it much more relevant is the universality that we talked about.
Yes.
That even though you cannot understand every aspect of the language of the English of the time, if you could at least make an effort to read a translation, a good translation, or an adaptation to our contemporary English, for at least you to identify with the themes and the complexity of the works. I
Yes.
think that would be a good starting point.
I think one good quote that Jonathan Bate says about Shakespeare in a book called Shakespeare Complete Works, he says that whether set or written in the past, all great plays speak to present times. And I think that that quote really expresses what we talked mostly about Shakespeare. It's atemporal.
And this temporality, has much to do with the conflicts that all societies, without distinction, they share. Because even although each society has its own dilemmas and characteristics, they share very, uh, they share basically the same conflicts at some level, at some moment.
Yes,
Uh, Jonathan Bate also says that so long we have wars, rape, codes of honor, violent acts of revenge, Shakespeare's tragic vision will go on being contemporary. Because it's for all time.
yes.
Revenge will not end, codes of honor will not end, our indecisiveness will not end.
Our questions about life
Yeah.
would not
And
end.
Shakespeare brings all of that into his place. So as long as we continue to be fascinated by human relationships, because that's what it is all about, his comic vision, his tragic vision, we will also remain alive.
Yes, I think that summarizes exactly what he represents to literature itself and society itself. And that's why I think Shakespeare should be read by anyone and revisit and not be given up just because of the language, just because you don't like reading plays, just because. Because I think we mentioned in the beginning good and bad experiences, but do the bad experiences determine for us that we don't like classics at all? No. No, we do. We do like them. We can like them. We can get used to them. And when we get the social relevance or literary relevance of that work, everything changes
Yeah.
in our vision, in our perspective, right?
That's the importance of giving it a try and not setting it aside just because it was written 300, 200, 100 years ago.
Yes.
When as we began this episode with that question, is classic lit really that important? Yes, it is. It is.
I think that's why it's called classic, right?
Yeah, because it remains alive.
Remains.
It goes through time.
Yeah.
As long as there are people that are willing to try to know that work, as people have been doing with Shakespeare, for example, as we said as an example today.
Well, guys, this was our second episode called Is Classic Literature Really That Important? We hope you like it.
And if you liked it, please share with your friends and don't forget to follow us on Instagram at lit.podcast.
And leave a comment on our post about this episode.
See you all in our next episode of Literary Tea Podcast.